Chief Justice Sundaresh Menon, Justice Belinda Ang, Judges and Judicial Commissioners of the Supreme Court of Singapore, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am saying on from the Singapore Mediation Center, and on behalf of the organizers, the SMC, Singapore Management University, and Eversheds Harry Elias LLP, I would like to welcome you to the 6th Annual Singapore Mediation Lecture. I would like to thank Eversheds Harry Elias LLP for their generous sponsorship of the Singapore Mediation Lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for a particularly distinguished speaker, a leading light in the field of mediation. You have your CVs on the program, but let me just say a few words about Professor Carrie Menkel-Meadow. Professor Menkel-Meadow is a Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and A.B. Chettle Professor of Law, Dispute Resolution and Civil Procedure at Georgetown University Law Center. She is one of the founders of the modern alternative/appropriate dispute resolution field and has been a mediator, arbitrator, facilitator, and working in the field of dispute resolution for over 30 years. To date, she has written 15 books and has 200 articles, at least 200 articles published on dispute resolution. Over and above that, she has been honored and been awarded not one, but 3 honorary doctorates for her work in dispute resolution and legal education. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Professor Carrie Menkel-Meadow with the topic Mediation 3.0, Merging the Old and the New. Professor?
Good evening, good afternoon, Chief Justice, Justices of the Supreme Court and the Courts of Appeal, and distinguished visitors, guests, students, professors, and citizens of Singapore. I am so happy to be here. Having lived here twice before, it is a great honor to come back to Singapore and to talk to you about my first love, my second love. My first love is down there. My second love, mediation. I want to take you on a tour, if you will, with me today, of about 1,000 or so, maybe 2,000 years of history. So we're going to get to Mediation 3.0 and what I know many of you have come to hear about, which is modern mediation and the use of technology in mediation. But you're going to have to sit through some history before we get there, because I think there are a lot of very complicated issues in this otherwise marvelous, wonderful process we use to bring people together. So we start with Mediation 1.0, the famous story of King Solomon and the baby. For those of you who don't know your Bible, 2 ladies, this is a portrait of the King Solomon story, 2 women fighting over a single baby, each claiming to be the mother of the baby. And they go to King Solomon, and we will return to King Solomon by the end of this lecture, because mediation began with wise elders, helping parties resolve their disputes. And one question to think about is, do we need wise elders, again, and if so, who should they be? And how wise should they be? And must they be elders? So the 2 women said, this is my baby, and for those of you who know the story, what did King Solomon do? He said, I'm going to take my sword and cut the baby in half. So for some of you who are arbitrators, you might hear people complaining about arbitrators who cut the baby in half. That is not what mediation does. Cutting the baby in half is a compromise that can be dangerous and cause death to the baby when we split the difference or split the baby for no reason. King Solomon threatened to cut the baby, and then what happened? One woman said, please don't cut the baby. And so King Solomon knew that that must be the real mother, because the real mother would not want to harm her baby and would be willing to give the baby to the other woman to preserve its life. I ask the question always, is that mediation, arbitration, or adjudication? Think about it. The origins of dispute resolution in that biblical story are not clear. It could be the first clever mediation. By threatening to cut the baby in half, the parties, the real mother, decided on her own to save the baby's life. And in pure mediation, it is the parties who decide, not the wise elder. But if the wise elder is wise enough, he will get the parties to solve their own problem in the right way, by asking the right questions and doing the right things. So after, or maybe even before that period, we have ancient mediation, and of course you all know that mediation actually began here in Asia and in Africa. So ancient mediation considered a Confucian principle of preserving harmony in resolving disputes, as opposed to the conflict, which was more common in the Western world, was an attempt to get societies and communities to resolve their disputes themselves, and if not, again, with a wise elder. Someone, the village elder, someone who controlled the people. In China, mediation was then co-opted, I would say, by the Communist Party, and we have a lot of work on Maoist mediation. Those of us who teach mediation actually show tapes of mediations that occurred during the Maoist period, in which the wise elder's job was to re-educate the community and to get people to do the right thing. That is the first example we see in China of re-engineering an old process. And that's what this talk is going to be about. How do we re-engineer an old process of mediation to meet new challenges? Now that we look at both Western and Eastern, we are looking at the cultural differences. And my colleague and friend Joel Lee, sitting right here, will see himself up here, as we modern mediators are confronting in places like Singapore and Hong Kong and Shanghai and New York and London and Stockholm, how do we mediate when the people who are having disputes have different cultures? Old and ancient mediation in the Bible and in Confucian's principles assumed a harmony and a similarity of cultural values. One challenge for us in Mediation 3.0 is how do we bring these cultures together? Technology is one answer, but not enough. Older mediation also comes from Africa. And again, the notion that a community resolves the dispute, not any individual. So in Gacaca in Rwanda and Ubuntu in South Africa, we have community mediators in which the community decides when 2 people or 3 people or 4 people are having a dispute. How do we resolve it? It takes a village to resolve a dispute. And that old principle of community dispute resolution was one of the sources of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the end of apartheid. A combination of Ubuntu, we all must share in our pain and in our culture, brought together with Desmond Tutu's Christianity, to give truth and reconciliation a focus, very important, on the future, not in the past. Arbitration and adjudication, they worry about what happened in the past. Mediation and resolution and restorative justice and Ubuntu focus on how can we resolve disputes best for the future. Then, a little bit later, we had ancient markets. We'll talk about that later. Commercial disputes in which the parties may not necessarily have ongoing relationships, though they still might if they have repeat player vendor-supply relationships. We had both arbitration and mediation in ancient markets. So the mediation that we are now doing in commercial centers like Singapore and in San Francisco and New York and London and Cairo and Stockholm and places with the arbitration centers as well as the mediation centers have a third party, and the question is, what does that third party do? Decide, which is what arbitrators and judges do, or facilitate relationships and conversations with the disputing parties. Very important in commercial relations, just as in the African village. Do we want to have a relationship in the future? And if so, how shall we communicate with each other? How shall we change our contract to make it better for the future, rather than fighting about what it meant when we first wrote it? Well, in our next little stop along the historical way, we wind up in feudal times, mostly in Western Europe, on the continent. How did we resolve disputes? With force and with God. We had jousts. We had people fighting on horses. We took disputants that had disputes with each other. We put hot stones in their hands. We threw them in lakes. We had them fight each other. And the principle of dispute resolution was, if you were right, God would save you. You would not sink into the lake. You would be not thrown off your horse and killed. And if we threw you in the fire, you would not burn. Well, at some point in medieval history, somebody realized that God didn't always get it right. Sometimes the community knew that somebody was innocent, and yet they burned, or they fell to the bottom of the lake, or they were knocked off their horse. And so we developed the modern legal system. And that system said, rather than letting God decide, or letting force decide, or nature, perhaps we should let the community decide, not facilitate a conversation, but decide. So we had rules of evidence, and parties presented arguments, and we had judges, and we had juries. Now, for those of you who don't remember any legal history, I hope you all had some, and since the Singapore legal system is in large measure still based on Old English principles, as is mine in the United States, the jury was originally just like those communities in Africa and just like those communities in the ancient markets. The jurors originally knew the parties. They were almost like witnesses. It is only in very recent history that, at least in the United States where we have juries, we want the juries to be neutral. I will return to that. Must the wise elder, must the mediator be neutral, or can the wise elder, like the old jurors of old times, be embedded in and know the community? To skip ahead a little bit to Mediation 3.0, those of you who are interested in technology and intellectual property will know that when disputants in the technology world have disputes with each other, they want a jury of their peers or a judge of their peers, meaning experts, people who understand technology and IT and are part of their community. So you can see that modern adaptations of old mediation are borrowing from the old principles of wise elders who know their community and understand the disputes. That is a complicated question. They are no longer neutral. So skipping ahead several hundred years, how do we get to where we are? I was just discussing with the Chief Justice a phenomenon that has happened in almost every modern industrialized nation, and a few that are not so modernized. The modern alternative dispute resolution movement has come from the defects in that jury and trial system. Why? Because in many legal systems, understand in Singapore too, and certainly in the United States and in much of Europe now, too many cases. And so one of the primary motivations for mediation in the system is the quantitative argument for mediation. Let's have some efficiency. Let's get parties to resolve their disputes in a different way so they won't take up a lot of court time and be very costly to themselves, to the parties, for the lawyers, and for the system. That's not the part of mediation I come from. I come from the second part up there, and that is the qualitative argument for mediation. I was a trial lawyer for many years. I was a poverty lawyer in the United States, and I won many cases, big class action cases, policy cases against the government, against big corporations, all in search of justice. And what did I see? I would win the case and not solve the problem. The next day, after the case was over, the clever government, the clever corporations would figure out some way around. Today I heard an interesting story that will explain what happened in those days. I was in a shop here in Singapore where I heard about one way to avoid some of the rules about animals is now to have lions and tigers mating. You all heard about these? What was the name again? Ligers? Ligers. I give you that example to tell you that clever business people and clever government officials will always figure out what we would call a workaround. When rules prohibit certain things, they're the ones who are creative and innovative, so we must always, those of us who care about justice, must always stay one step ahead. So I was interested in solving problems and thinking one step ahead from what the legal judgment might do. And so I began many years ago, a little over 30 years ago, to teach negotiation and mediation in law schools and to teach students to solve problems rather than only to win the case. There was a third argument for mediation, very important, and that is political empowerment. In the American consumer protection movement in the 1970s and 80s, the idea was that the dispute belonged to the parties themselves and not to the legal system. So mediation was intended to give a place for people to talk about their own disputes with each other and to try to resolve them with each other, as opposed to being dependent on the state. And from those developments, 3 different criteria, 3 different arguments for mediation, which I'll return to at the end of this lecture, we get mediation and its development, and this is its definition, a voluntary process of self-determination of the parties with the facilitation of a third party, focused on the future, not only the past, so perhaps no need for fact-finding, and outcomes that solve the problem, and as I would say, are tailored to the parties' needs, and also can sometimes be contingent, changeable. This has turned out to be very important in environmental mediation in the United States. We mediate land use disputes. We mediate disputes between animals and people. We mediate disputes about water. And what happens is the science changes in the middle of the mediation. So think about the advantages of mediation as adapting. We call this adaptive management, adapting to change, a process that mediation can do better than a court system can do, because we can come back to the mediator and redo an agreement if the one that we first agreed on isn't working anymore, subject to new information. So the very end of Mediation 1.0 was the beginning of the modern ADR movement in the 1970s and 1980s, and there were 2 very big ideas here. Dorcas, where's Dorcas in the audience, studied with Frank Sander at Harvard, the founder of the multi-door courthouse. The idea that a courthouse should be not only about adjudication, but should allow the parties to choose the process that is appropriate for their dispute. So sometimes we'll go to a mediator to help us have a conversation and preserve our relationship, as in family law and labor law and commercial relations, and sometimes we will need a judge, a King Solomon, to make a decision, because the court must rule on a very important question that affects the whole legal community, and everyone needs a decision. In between those, we developed other processes, ombuds, Mead-Arb, Arb-Mead, those are variations on mediation and arbitration, conciliation, in which the mediator has a little bit more power than a traditional mediator, and now in the United States, we have variations on this theme. We have mediators that evaluate and come very close to arbitration by telling the parties what they think the dispute is all about and what that King Solomon would do if the case ever went to trial. So the very end of Mediation 1.0, about 10 to 20 years ago and continuing to the present, is a lot of legal regulation. This is where you get your continuing education credit. A lot of regulation about ADR. In 2008, the European Union passed a directive which said that all the countries, all the members of the European Union, had to provide for cross-border mediation in any commercial relation. So every country has now been urged to develop mediation. And the interesting question in Europe is whether the country is going to be dualist, providing legislation for mediation in cross-border disputes as well as internally in their own nation, or whether they're going to be monist, meaning they're only going to do mediation in cross-border disputes and not let it affect their disputing within the country. And that's what the Europeans are worrying about a lot right now. For those of you who are really interested in this subject, at the end of September, the European Union issued a new report, not surprisingly to me, I've been studying this for a long time, saying there has been differential uptake of mediation in different countries. The European Union is full of many different cultures. We return to the question of culture. Italy tried to make mediation mandatory several years ago, and some of you know this. What happened? The lawyers in Italy went on strike. It was taking over 5 to 10 years to get a trial in Italy at the time, and the legislation, the parliament in Italy decided if we made everyone go to mediation, it would cut the caseload and make things faster and cheaper and more accessible for everyone. The lawyers said, it will hurt us. We won't make our fees. And so the lawyers went on strike, and then they went to the Italian Constitutional Court, and the Italian Constitutional Court ruled that making people go to mandatory mediation was a violation of the equivalent of due process in the Italian Constitution. So making it totally mandatory didn't work. There have been questions about whether mandatory mediation is a violation of the European Covenant on Human Rights, Article 6, which guarantees due process and a hearing. And the British courts have held, no, as long as you still preserve a right to trial, you can make people go to mediation, and the Brits have done that, including adopting some forms of penalties and the inability of someone to not receive costs if they don't try mediation first. So in England, there have been a series of cases about when one must go to mediation, just short of the mandatory program in Italy. But the new European study says different countries are adopting mediation for different purposes. I wrote an article a couple of years ago in which I examined which countries have mediation and which don't. And I'm proud, you should be proud here in Singapore to know that you are one of the only countries in which the Mediation Center that is sponsoring this lecture is as powerful and as popular as it is, and located right close to the Supreme Court, so we have models of both mediation and court processes existing together. As some of you know, I believe he was one of the earlier lecturers. Lord Woolf in England also attempted to make mediation mandatory there. Instead, they now require people to go to mediation before they can litigate. A recent study in England says, however, that now the costs of litigation have been made to the front-loading, and so many lawyers are quite resistant in England as well. Now, I want to say one final legal point so you can get your education credit here. One of the very big problems for mediation, a very big legal problem for those of you who study these processes, is that you know that if you're doing an international arbitration, the New York Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards allows immediate enforcement of an arbitration award in any country, and there are now close to 150 signatories to the New York Convention. So an arbitration award is enforceable in any one of those countries that is signed on to the convention. We do not have the equivalent of that in mediation. So for those of you who are here because you're interested in globalization and international mediation, our challenge legally, and the UNCITRAL at the UN is working on this, is to craft a convention that will give mediation agreements enforceability from one country to another. But that is an unresolved issue. So, mediation 1.0, pure mediation. 2 parties, 1 mediator, facilitating conversations. We then move to more modern history, mediation 2.0. When Dorcas and I were talking about this lecture, she said, why don't you talk about mediation 2.0, all of the modern adaptations of what I've just told you in the past history. But the truth is, for us in the United States, mediation 2.0 has a very bad name. We call it mediation light. And mediation light, L-I-T-E, mediation light is what happened when some courts decided it was a very good idea to have mediation, and they made everybody go to mediation without any regulation at all of who the mediators would be or what they should do. No wise elders. We had lots of unwise youngers doing mediation, people who thought it was a lovely way to make peace in the world, and they had wonderful intentions, but they didn't know what they were doing. And so people were ordered to show up at hearings or go to mediation without any clear purpose of what was intended. And so what was supposed to be, remember, as pure mediation, a voluntary process of self-determination and communication, became compelled and mandatory. And our judges then had to decide if the parties were there with good faith intentions. And if they weren't, they got fined. There were penalties. Things happened to them. And so we began to get formal rules and the requirement that one had to go to mediation before litigation. And we now have horrible stories of coercive mediators. For those of you who are interested, we've had our first set of articles on mediator malpractice, mediators forcing parties to do things, keeping them in the room for 10 or 12 or 15 hours without food, without medication, without sleep. And I just read last night a horrible story of a mediator who in the United States was disbarred as a lawyer in one state, Vermont, and moved to another state, Arizona, and held out his shingle as a mediator, and then cheated his clients out of over $1 million for 5 years before anyone did anything about it. Why? No regulation. So for those of you, again, interested in the future of mediation, what regulation ought there to be? Credentialing, licensing, quality control, these are very big issues. This is an astonishing story. This man is now in jail. He was criminally prosecuted, but there was no professional regulation. There were no rules in Arizona about being a mediator, and the fact that he lost his legal license as a lawyer had no bearing on his ability to be a mediator. So those are problems that we have. And as I said earlier, some mediation is now becoming more like arbitration. The most common thing happening in the United States now is people say they're going to mediation, they ask for a good mediator, and then they say, I'm a mediator. How would you decide this case? What do you think we should do? And the parties will ask the mediator to be that King Solomon who actually cuts the baby and makes a decision rather than talking to each other. So I want to say a few words about why I think Mediation 2.0 is a problem. These are some of the new developments in some bad forms of mediation practice. There's a very, very successful commercial mediator in the United States who handles very, very big cases. And he has now said, no more joint meetings. They're inefficient. Rather than bringing the parties together, I'll just get on the telephone, technology, I'll get on the telephone and I'll talk to each party and I'll see what they have in mind, and then I'll think about what's a good solution, then I'll call them back and I'll tell them what I think they should do. And he's very, very, very successful. And he's making a lot of money and he gets called by many parties. And I personally think that's not mediation. The parties are not talking to each other. So the Chief Justice and I were talking about reducing acrimony, which is one of the most important things a mediator can do, and this reduces acrimony. The parties are never in the room together, and the mediator is doing all the work, and it does reduce acrimony. But the problem is, if those people have to get together again and do anything in the future, in a commercial situation, in a family situation, they have not repaired their relationship. They have not done Ubuntu. They have not done gachacha. They have not looked in each other's eyes and understood each other, even if they disagree. That, in my view, is not mediation. But that is becoming the norm, and that is something I worry about. Now, the next thing the same mediator has been talking about doing is not taking any notes at all. Now, he says this is a good thing because then the mediator can really listen and isn't busy typing or writing things down, and so he can really hear the parties, and he's not taking any notes. But why do I think he's doing this? He's doing this to avoid any potential malpractice litigation against him. Should he mess up in any way, there will be no record at all of what he's doing. So beware the mediator that discusses a particular skill choice, something they're choosing to do, and they dress it up in some wonderful mediation language. I'm not taking notes so that I can hear you. When the truth is, I've done many complex mediations without taking notes. How can I remember what somebody said? And if I am paraphrasing, repeating what one party has said to another party, if I don't get it accurately right, I might actually increase the acrimony by making it worse. So I think, for me, we need to keep taking notes, and it's a problem not to. These are all shortcuts promised to make mediation more effective. Mediators are now doing most of their work, in commercial cases anyway, and also in family cases, in separate meetings, ex parte. The mediator only meets with one party. As I told you, I think that's a problem for trying to make those relationships better. To the extent that mediation is about communication and bringing the parties together, keeping people in separate rooms is not a good idea. Now, keeping people together is a very difficult skill. And so those of us in the room, there are many here who are very skilled mediators. It takes us many years to develop those skills to be able to listen and to facilitate conversation between the parties. Mediation is now, in many situations when the courts require it, dominated by the lawyers who continue to be adversarial. And as the European Union report just said at the end of September, What is needed still, after all these years, I've been at this for 30 years, is to create a culture that is not so adversarial. So the lawyers need to be trained. That's why it's wonderful to give a lecture like this in a law school. Modern law students need to learn other skills, how to bring parties together, as well as make arguments, but arguments is not the only thing. So what are some of the good parts of Mediation 2.0? There are a few. Having developed some good forms of mediation, we're now putting them together, and we're developing some very creative innovation. Now, I'm getting to what I know you all want, Mediation 3.0 and technology and all this, and the language of disruption and innovation. I prefer non-disruptive innovation, okay? That's part of my philosophy of problem solving. Can we innovate and do new things without necessarily disrupting and being nasty and competitive and conflictual with somebody else? So hybrids are a form of innovation without disruption. We take forms of dispute resolution, we put them together. Mediation, we try to bring the parties together, we try to work it out, and only if it doesn't work do we become King Solomon. I've been talking to you for 3 days or 3 months or 3 hours, and we don't seem to be going anywhere. Maybe you would like to shift to arbitration, or maybe you'd like to have what we're calling final offer mediation. I've been listening to you for a while. Here are some ideas I have, but they're not binding. I'm not a judge. I'm not an arbitrator. Hear what I have to say, and if you like it, take it, and if you don't like it, don't. That's a hybrid. That's not pure mediation. It's a hybrid, but it's working very effectively. Mediators Without Borders. A group of mediators following Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, have decided we are the healing profession. And so the good part of Mediation 2.0 is that we don't only work in our own countries. If we have skills in making peace, many of us have joined this group, we offer to go and try to resolve disputes in conflictual settings outside of our own countries. In those of you who are commercial lawyers or want to be commercial lawyers, mediation is now being talked about for trade disputes, for investment disputes, WTO, and international public investment disputes have mostly used arbitration, but increasingly we are beginning to see the parties realizing that losing an arbitration is a binary, brittle solution. One party wins and one party loses. And both investment situations, foreign direct investment, and trade relationships are ongoing relationships. So they're just like those commercial markets in ancient times, and they're sometimes more like families than you can imagine. And so there's been a big push to bring mediation into the international world. The International Mediation Institute is a group of mediators based originally in Holland and now internationally, which is trying to facilitate the use of mediation both domestically and internationally, and is also developing standards of ethics and intercultural competency and training. So those of us who mediate in different cultures and across countries will have to take tests and have to be credentialed so we know that people actually know what they're doing. If you've been following anything that's been going on in the United States, seeing the killings in black communities by police officers, we have now had a huge influx of community mediation, which is where the field began in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And Ohio State is one of the centers which is now training people to go into neighborhoods and communities with a lot of conflicts and to try to take mediation between two parties, the pure model I showed you, and scale it up. How do we mediate with whole communities, both preventatively before a conflict happens and during a conflict? So these are all efforts to take the idea of pure mediation and move them into different places. Finally, we get to one of the reasons many of you are here, and that is the use of mediation through other media and technologies. Now, I begin, for me, moving from Mediation 2.0 to Mediation 3.0 with my experience in the Washington Court of Appeals. I was a mediator in the court just below the US Supreme Court, and in the late 1990s, that court began using technology for distance mediation. Big country, the United States, and lots of litigation against federal agencies. So they brought in the very first round of technology, and I was asked to mediate by telephone, like an early Skype, with a very big screen about this big, And one party was in Wyoming, and one party was in Vermont, and one party was in Washington, D.C., and I was sitting in the courthouse in Washington, D.C., and we would mediate, joint session, and then if I wanted a separate session, I'd click one of the buttons and somebody would go away and do something else, and I would talk to only one party. It was a big failure, in my view, and I didn't like it. Can anybody think about why? I like lectures to be interactive. I'm a mediator. Right, so when they were off screen, they felt excluded, exactly right. Not a part of it. Very good. There's another big one. That was the first one. There's another big reason. Why else? Would you like to be on the screen right now so that I could see the little bubbles of what's going on in your head? People were afraid then of what's actually happened now. Confidentiality, security, and they couldn't believe, even though we told them, that I wasn't taping it, right? That anything they said might be kept in some way, and they would have no control over the information. So I want you to think about that as one of my themes also. How do mediators develop trust in the parties? And how can parties have trust in the whole process when we start to use equipment? So that was my first movement from Mediation 2.0, required mandatory mediation and all of its variations, to attempts to bring technology into mediation. And so I was dragged kicking and screaming and reluctantly into the new field of online dispute resolution. And I know that's what a lot of you want to hear about. So I want to say, this is the most important thing I want to say about technology and mediation. Like any form of technology, there are good things and bad things. I'm about to tell you a story that I suspect will be one of the few things you'll definitely remember from this lecture. Every time there has been an advance in technology, what's the first use of that technology? Does anybody know? What do you think? When we went from paintings on the walls in the caves, and then we went to create words, and then we got the printing press and we created books, and then we created art and paintings, and then from books we went to film and video, and now we have computers. What do you think the first thing happened? Some of you might think, because I talked about King Solomon, the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, you might have been told that was what we used the printing press for. Anybody? What? Absolutely. Who said that? Raise your hand. A+. Pornography. If you don't know about it, there's some quite amazing research and scholarship to show by communication scholars that every time technology happened, the first use that was put to that technology was to make pornography. So I just want you to remember that, because technology has also done amazing things. We wouldn't be here, right? We have the screen, my voice is being amplified by this. So we need technology and we're using it. And I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture talking about both the pluses and the minuses of technology. So ask yourself, do you want a pornographic dispute resolution process, or do you want a dispute resolution process that brings the people together in a meaningful way? So I want to say that technology can be used in lots of different ways. Number one, support. And in that sense, technology is a wonderful help to mediation. People can upload their files, again, confidentiality problems, yes, but I can read things before the parties come to meet me. They can send me pictures. We can use Skype to have conference calls before we actually get together. So technology can be a very useful support in a mediation process. Sometimes we may want someone to be in another room. I used to do a lot of child abuse and neglect cases when I was a practicing lawyer, and one of the questions was, should judges be allowed to talk to the children? So we can now use technology to put children in a safe room where they can play with toys, and a judge can talk to them either in person or not, and we can use technology to change the form of communication in a positive way. Technology can supplement what we do. So for some of you who may have studied this field, you might know one of the first online forms of dispute resolution was a site called Chettle. And Chettle took people that were in litigation with each other and would otherwise have had a negotiation, I make an offer, you make an offer, and we start negotiating, and we'll probably wind up splitting the baby, as King Solomon would say. But CyberSettle allowed us to make simultaneous offers to each other, and a computer program would let us know if we were in range. And the way CyberSettle operated, each party had 3 opportunities to make offers, and if they were getting closer together, the computer would say, keep going, you may reach a settlement. These are mostly in monetary commercial disputes. And if after 3 rounds of offers you were still too far apart, you better go back to the drawing board. That is support and supplementation of a dispute resolution process. So the mediator is behind the curtain, behind the screen, or in the computer, helping the people. Now, in some places, technology is in fact replacing other forms of dispute resolution. And this is where some of you will have different views than I will. You might know that the British are planning to have an online civil court. Lord Briggs has written a very famous report. Lord Fulford talked about this report at last year's online dispute resolution meeting at The Hague. And he said, Lord Fulford said, we're going to be selling our court buildings. I don't know how you justices feel about that. The Brits need a lot of money. They're having big economic problems. We can sell our courthouses and make a lot of money, and we're going to make everyone whose dispute is below a certain amount of money do all of their disputing online. Here's an advantage: access, simple forms. You won't need lawyers. What's your dispute? You just write in your claims, you put it in the program, the defense gets to respond, and then you'll negotiate with each other. And if you need a judge, fine, the judge will be in his office and he can log on and decide the case. Now, Lord Fulford very cutely said when he was speaking in The Hague last year, I wonder that the judges are going to get paid a lot of money to just sit in their office and play Candy Crush all day. Because if the system is totally successful, who will need them? I had a different worry about it, and that is, in these so-called smaller claims, these online court systems in British Columbia also is another place that has one, the Civil Resolution Center, currently operational for all cases below a certain value. They began with condominium and property disputes, and now they moved on to civil cases generally. How are those disputes resolved? Algorithmically. If X, then Y. And so people like me are beginning to write articles and to be worried about robotic justice. I believe the advantage of technology and mediation and dispute resolution is potentially more access to more people, remote areas. That's why it's attractive in British Columbia, a very big province in Canada. So people all the way in the north who can't get to courts very easily will be able to do things on a computer. Access simple language, not leading a lot of legal claims, so good access. What I worry about is the justice part. This requires artificial intelligence in which very complex legal rules will have to be turned into code that preserves documents, that analyzes keywords, and then spits out solutions. Now, the pro-technology people, and I assume when we have the Q&A, we'll talk about some of this, the pro-technology people say the solutions will be better because we'll be able to use computers for data mining to see that lots and lots of people are actually complaining about the same thing. So somebody can analyze the cases that have been brought and see that there's a problem with a particular company and overcharging, or there's a problem with a particular landlord or a property owner. And if so many people are complaining, we can aggregate those claims and we can do something about it. So we can have data mining and analysis, and we can actually produce mass solutions for mass problems. Or using crowdsourcing and having people put up their claims online, we'll be able to see other people's ideas. I'm a problem solver. I spend a lot of time in my classes teaching students creativity. Using technology and saying, I have a problem with my landlord, what do the rest of you think? Crowdsourcing. Now, I'm going to quickly give you an example that some of you may or may not remember. It's 2011, and I was teaching at the other law school across town, NUS, and I was teaching international dispute resolution, and my students brought to me a case that was in the Singapore Mediation Center. And it was a kind of dispute that we're now having in California and having all around the world. The dispute was curry smells in the building. You know that the people remember this case, or you have many of them? People complaining the curry smell was too strong, and this went to the mediation center. And so my students who were studying mediation with me brought it to me, and what was so interesting to me was the report on the Singapore page, webpage, the public webpage for Singapore, said that the mediator, I hope the mediator's not in the room, the mediator decided that the way to handle this problem was curry cooking would be reserved from hours 4 to 7 or 4 to 8, and no cooking either before or after. Now, there were two very interesting things about that case as I analyzed it. First of all, everybody recognized it wasn't just about curry. It had to do with one of the things that I think, myself as an outsider, this city does extremely well, this country, and that is diversity. The curry dispute was about Chinese, Indian, Malays, and people living together in housing blocks and having to deal with cooking habits. Now, almost all of those cuisines use curry, right? So the dispute wasn't really about curry. It really had to do, back to gacaca and Ubuntu, it had to do with how the community was going to live together. So that's an example of using one dispute to realize that it's not just a dispute, it's a conflict. Dispute is between two people, and a conflict is a bigger issue. But the part that was Mediation 3.0 for me and made one of the advantages of technology was there followed, and I printed them out and I took them home with me, over 2,000 comments from people in the city responding to that dispute. Some of them very nasty and very acrimonious, Chief Justice, and some of them saying, it's very important for us to deal with these issues as a society. And I thought there was more free speech and engagement on this issue online in Singapore in that moment than I've ever seen in my so-called free speech country. Now we have plenty of acrimonious conversation there online. But it was an example of how using technology can do something that I care very much about, and that is scaling up mediation processes. So things that we use for single parties having disputes with each other, that if we can facilitate well a conversation about what's important to you and what's important to me, and how are we going to deal with this in the future, had the potential to involve many more people than just the disputants. And I thought that was a very good use of technology in dispute resolution. However, it can't, in my view, totally replace some of the old-fashioned models. And that's the concern that many critics have of ODR and technology. Can it truly replace, in all cases, the in-person argument, the in-person discussion, the in-person resolving of problems? For those of you who know of his work, Richard Susskind in the United Kingdom has written a series of books predicting the end of lawyers. If all of this mediation online, where we can file our claims online and deal with each other, is successful, they won't need us anymore. I don't think it will ever happen. And in his latest book, The Future of the Professions, he's claiming this is going to affect all professions, not just lawyers. We can diagnose our medical problems online, and many of us do that. We read all the medical sites, and we figure out what our symptoms are. What I worry about is what I call algorithmic or digital or robotic justice. Lots of access, but lots of concern on my part for the quality of what's coming out of the system. And let me just suggest to you, because Singapore, like my legal system, is a more common law-based system. I think it's an interesting thought experiment. Those of you who are interested in comparative law might ask yourself whether technology and mediation dispute resolution is going to be more successful in civil code countries, where everything is statutory and codified, rather than in our common law systems where judges still have discretion and still have to explain their reasons, and that we still look at cases that are like each other and cases that are unlike each other to come up with different solutions. So the question I try to pose for artificial intelligence and robotic justice is, not all legal systems are alike. And I fear that turning all of the law and the outcomes and the solutions into algorithms will turn into a uniformity that will not exist so easily in a common law system, unless you think we should change the common law system, and we should all move to codes. So that's a problem. There are, on this slide, examples of many successful forms of online dispute resolution. The Chief Justice and I were talking about one that we both like. The Dutch have a new program called, in their Wegwijzer program. This is an example for me of very good ODR. Why? It's interactive. Parties that are seeking a divorce log on and they say, we're having trouble in our marriage, we're thinking about getting divorced, and they have to answer a series of questions. What were the last fights that you have? What are you fighting about? The children, the money? What's the issues? And you fill out the questions. And then there's a program to figure out if the husband and wife, or the partners, they don't have to be married in this system, because it also divides property. What are your issues? And then the program says, from your answers, it looks like things may not be so bad. Would you like to see a marriage counselor? That's what the program says. And if you say yes, then pictures pop up on the screen of marriage counselors with their CVs, and you can choose a marriage counselor, and then you can either call them up or go in person. So the Wegwijzer system is allowing, again, support, not replacement, by letting people get some information online and then go to a real person if they want to. If it is an amicable divorce, this program allows the parties to put in their financial information and their preferences for child custody. I want the children on Christmas, I want the children on New Year's, I want the children on Tuesdays, I want the children on weekends. And if they want, they can actually do their own custody system online. Or the program says, would you like some help? Would you like a facilitator? And if you say yes, then you get, again, an array of faces of mediators, several of whom are retired judges, who I know very well. Very distinguished Dutch, Holland and Dutch judges who have trained to be mediators, and then you can either go in person and meet with the mediator, or you can work with the mediator online. That, to me, is a good use of technology and mediation. Parties get information, and then they choose whether to do it themselves online, or to get a third party and to use a fourth party. The fourth party is the computer. So two parties, third party mediator, fourth party computer, and the parties get to choose how much they want to use of technology. Now I'll give you another example of one up there that's working that I'm less happy with, and that is Ohio has developed an online program. By the way, these programs were all designed by the person who gave you your lecture last year, Colin Rule. Almost everything, not all of them, but almost everything up here is a product of Modria down there, which is a company that Colin Rule founded to develop online platforms for dispute resolution. More about that in one moment. But the Ohio online platform is a site where you can contest your property taxes. So you get a bill from the state of Ohio, or the cities in Ohio, and it says, we've reassessed your property, and you have to pay more taxes next year. And you say, I disagree with this assessment. I want to complain about it. What's the law? What is the basis for this assessment? Some of it's factual. So you can request that someone will come and look at your property. But most of it, the site says, here's the law, and the site then lets the lay person without a lawyer read cases and make their own argument. Sounds great. Self-help, dispute resolution, computer program acting as mediator. Here's the information, see what you can do. What do I not like about it? Who's writing the program, aside from Modria? Colin Rule just designed the platform. But who's putting the content on that platform? The state, the government, the people you're fighting with. So that's less acrimonious. We don't have lawyers fighting with each other. And it's not quite Big Brother of 1984, but I worry a lot that the content on these online dispute resolution systems is very problematic. Who's writing the programs? Who's doing the content devising? Is it the government? Is it the very person you're disputing with? Now, these are all public programs, and I just want to spend one moment talking about a place where I think technology is working in a very interesting way, and that's the private sector. So for those of us who have disputes with big companies, I fight with airlines all the time. or Amazon. I fight with Amazon almost every day. In the old days, I could pick up the telephone and find a customer service agent at Amazon or one of the airlines. What are the big corporations doing now? Online dispute resolution. Again, access. I don't need a lawyer to fight with United Airlines or Amazon. I just say I have a complaint, and I get a tiny little space to write my complaint, or I get a tick box, price, quality, delivery. I get to put my complaint in some category. And this is where algorithmic justice sometimes works, sometimes. I get my disputes with Amazon resolved almost like that now. Why? Because the algorithm says, this professor buys a book almost every day. She's a big customer. We want to treat her well. Literally, I found this out. So if the dispute is less than $200, just pay her. The last time we had a dispute about something, it was the quality. We sent in a complaint about, and before we even returned the item to them, the credit came in my account. That's another form of repeat play, an ethical problem. Do repeat players get better justice than others? I wonder about the person who's buying their first product on Amazon and tries to use customer service and can't. So the good news is access. I don't need a lawyer to fight with Amazon. But I worry that if the algorithm doesn't favor me, or you, whoever's having the dispute, that there's going to be a problem. Now, there's a young scholar in the United States who's actually written an article about this, Rory Van Loo, also a graduate of the Harvard negotiation program. And Rory Van Loo calls this corporate injustice and another form of privatization of justice. Now again, it's a double-edged sword because I think remember the sword? That keeps coming back, King Solomon's sword? It's just like King Solomon's sword. It can work. If we hold the sword over the head, sometimes it gets resolved. And in this case, for smaller disputes, who wants to go to court, who wants to fight, being able to resolve online can be very, very efficient. On the other hand, there's no discretion, and there may not be justice. On the other hand, there may be more justice to the extent we analyze, and all of the people resolving customer service disputes of this sort, they can look at all the disputes, they can actually see the outcomes, they can study them for equity and equality, and they can mark the ones that are not being treated properly. So there is a form of appeal in that process. It's not an appellate court, but somewhere behind that computer is some customer service and corporate manager who's taking a look at the disputes that are going on in the company. And again, if you think about those ligers that I was talking about, the lions and tigers, I think that for many forms of private dispute resolution, this kind of internalized, mediative, technological dispute resolution is growing far faster than the use of this technology in the public sector. I don't know if that's a good thing. So let me just conclude. Here, we're getting to the end. Here are some of the issues in Mediation 3.0, and I'll just lay them before you, and then we'll talk about them further in the Q&A. I worry about confidentiality and privacy. You guys are now all going to be invited to use Twitter to suggest questions to me. I am not on Twitter. I am not on Facebook. I am not on Snapchat. I am on LinkedIn. I have not elected to be on any of these social media because I worry about this. I want to preserve what little privacy I have in the world. I've taught in many countries. I have many students all over the place, and I want to be in control of when I get contacted. Online dispute resolution worries me in that respect. And question number 2 up here, security. Some of you may know we have just had an enormous security breach in the United States. Equifax, which is one of the ratings of our credit ratings in the United States, has now compromised the personal information of 1/2 of the country. 143 million files, social security numbers, driver's licenses, ages, names have been hacked. Do we know? We don't know yet who did it, do we? 143 million people in a country of 300 million people. I think I'm probably one of them. I haven't figured it out yet, because you can't control that. And so people are being advised to close down their credit cards. I know that our hospital, UCLA Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the United States, the medical records have been hacked there too. So the extent to which we are uploading our confidential information in order to resolve disputes and give information to mediators, I worry about that. As I've said before, legal authority. Who is writing these algorithms? So we have computer programmers as judges. Richard Susskind talks about the elimination of lawyers. I would say, what happens when we eliminate judges, who are supposed to be the wise elders of our society, or at least the wise people of our society. They don't necessarily have to be old. But think about it. Robotic justice and algorithmic justice, we can have non-lawyers writing the rules for who gets redress and who gets justice in our system. Some of you may think that's a good thing, to open up the legal profession and people who decide disputes who don't have any legal training and who may not have to care about whether there's a valid contract or not. But I worry about that. Who's writing the justice rules? As I mentioned earlier, translation issues. How do we take complex legal rules and turn them into code on technology? Now, when I had to take the law school admission test as a young person to get into a good law school in the United States, we had these very complicated fact situations on that test. And later on, when I went to law school, I recognized that some of those things on my test were actual cases. Hadley versus Baxendale, I imagine everyone in this room has studied that case. Contract remedies. I don't know how many of you can still recite the rule of Hadley versus Baxendale, but tonight, go home as a thought experiment and try to write it for code. How would you put into a computer program what the contract expectation damages would be if the mill was broken and the shaft was broken and you couldn't actually perform your mill services? Inequalities, big problem, the digital divide. Who doesn't have a computer? I spent the weekend in Cambodia, and so we were talking to some of the people that we met about how something like this would work in a place where many people still don't have computers. Answer? Almost everyone has a cell phone. So miniaturization, also, another issue. People use their cell phones to resolve disputes. And I do want to quickly here mention a very, very interesting positive form of technology, and that is a program that was demonstrated to me at this year's ODR meeting in Paris, and that was an online dispute, ODR for refugees, a site in which they give people in refugee camps cell phones in which they can complain about things in the refugee camps and attempt to get some answer and resolution from the UN or people that are running the refugee camps. And this is now in beta testing. Giving people in the refugee camps a cell phone in which they can try to resolve disputes. That's a good use of technology. And think about it, though. Again, what kind of dispute can you have on a cell phone so that people can read it and respond with a few simple keys? But that's one example. Another problem I just want to mention to you, it's starting to happen. I had up on this list of samples, Australia and many countries now let you pay your traffic violations online. Another form of dispute resolution online. No mediator. You're told you got a speeding ticket, and if you go online, you can pay your ticket, low cost, no judge. But if you try to contest it, it gets a lot more complicated. We now have social scientists who have studied who's getting tickets, who's getting arrested, who is more likely to commit crimes again. And so we have what's called predictive coding for predictive sentencing. And the computer can keep track of how many speeding tickets you have, right? So even if you try to get out of it, the computer will know, and the next time you get into trouble, the computer will automatically take your driver's license away, right? Or the computer will see this is the 4th time you've committed a burglary, off to jail you go forever, or for a long time in the United States. 3 strikes and you're out, literally, life imprisonment. So there's no discretion in these systems, and it's just something I worry about. Privatization, as I mentioned to you, as the big companies are asking us to do all of our disputing online, what's going to create the precedents of the future? And I say to the judges and justices, you spend a lot of time writing opinions and decisions. Are we going to have access to the decisions that go on online? How will we know what proper behavior is if these things are not public? So we have some good things, some good innovations. There may be less bias, right? It's a cool medium. People can't yell at each other, although that's not my experience. I've had some pretty heated email conversations with my colleagues. And in fact, some people say this makes it worse. Flame mail, I don't know what that is. When you don't have a person in front of you, you can actually get nastier easier on a computer. On the other hand, we have online brainstorming, crowdsourcing for better solutions. And the final thing I'd say about some of the private dispute resolution, these reputational rating services, Amazon, and for us in the United States, Yelp, we go to a restaurant, we like it, 5 stars, we don't like it, 0 stars. We're actually finding that those reputational rating services are mediators. They're resolving disputes. You go to get a service and you don't like it and you put up a bad reputation and the company will call you right away. I'll fix it. If you take down the bad reputation, I'll refund your money, I'll give you a new product. One of my godchildren, a young woman in her 20s, went to stay in an Airbnb in Switzerland over the summer. She had a terrible time. She posted a terrible reputation on Airbnb. And the woman who ran the place called her up and said, first, I'm going to call the police on you if you don't change my reputation, which was ridiculous. They were from different countries. I don't think Interpol is going to handle a bad Airbnb reputation. And then she said, if you take it down, I'll not only refund your money, I'll give you more money. Is that a bribe? Is that a bribe? So think about that. It's both efficient, reputations can resolve disputes, and then what happens if people post incorrectly? Defamation. So technology may resolve disputes, but it also makes new ones. And in a wonderful book written by 2 colleagues of mine, Ethan Katch and Orna Rabinovitz-Eini, they just did a book, Digital Justice. And so they're talking about what I'm talking about here, the pluses of technology and also the ways in which our living on technology is creating new disputes. So we will need some mediated dispute resolution online. So here are some quick solutions that I have. I began this lecture with King Solomon trying to save the baby and the 3 different goals and purposes of the modern ADR movement. Efficiency, in my case, efficacy, better solutions, quality solutions, tailored solutions, contingent solutions, or empowerment and political participation. When we frame dispute resolution mediated online, what's our purpose? Be clear about purpose. You cannot solve all of the world's problems with technology. And any online platform or any use of technology has to have a purpose. If it's not clear about what it's doing, it's going to be distorted in some way. It may turn into a lion and a tiger. And maybe that's a good thing, but we were told today that the ligers can't breed, just like a mule, right? You take a donkey and a horse and they make a mule and they can't breed. That may be a good thing. How do we train ourselves, those of us that are judges, are lawyers, and disputants, to deal in this new world? Interpersonal communication is different online. As I told you, flame mail can make it worse, but asynchronous communication can make it better. Timeouts online. I send you a proposal, and you don't have to respond right away. In my negotiation and mediation classes now at home, we have online negotiations going on from school to school. So next week, my students in California will do a negotiation with students in New York. And the idea is for them to learn the new skills of how negotiation and mediation might be different online when they can't see each other, or when they use Skype. It's up to them. We're going to let them use email, or we're going to say, if you want to see the person, you may go on Skype. So we have to think about training. And I want to suggest, since I told you that Lord Briggs wants to sell all the courthouses in England, you might ask yourself whether you think it's a good or a bad thing that we have courthouses in public institutions where people have to come together in a public place and have their disputes and create precedents. I've suggested in a recent article of mine that if all this online stuff becomes a true substitute for mediation, the places where people will go will not be the courthouses, but the public libraries where they can find computers. And if you don't believe me, there's a wonderful movie, Ken Loach, the British director, I, Daniel Blake, which is about an elderly man trying to get some benefits that he deserves from the British government, and he's completely unable to use a computer because he's an older guy and he didn't learn this. And where does he go? Not to the courthouse. Every time he goes to the social worker, he doesn't get an answer. The social worker says, you have to apply online. And he doesn't know how to do it. Who helps him? The librarian. He goes to the public library in his community, and that public librarian helps him fill out all of his applications. So it's the public libraries rather than the public courthouses, or at least for older people, their children, that will help them. But you have to think about who's going to be advantaged by this form of technology and who will be disadvantaged. There are always winners and losers in this. So finally, I want to end with my mantra in my field here: one size does not fit all. Frank Sanders said, let's have a multi-door courthouse. I'm famous in the United States for saying what we need is process pluralism. We need to think about what process is appropriate for what dispute. We can't always do everything in one forum. So there are times when we're going to want, in the kind of work I do, face-to-face reconciliation, learning about what we care about, and meeting person to person. But if I'm having a fight with Amazon about a single book and it's the wrong delivery, I don't need to meet with Amazon face-to-face. I'm happy to do that online. So we live in a time in which we have to be very sophisticated about what kind of a dispute we have, and whether or not we want King Solomon, the wise king, to draw a sword and to avoid splitting the baby, or whether there are things that we can do on our own. And I leave you with the thought that we don't exactly know how this is all going to turn out. As I said, every time we've had a new technological advance, it's been used for both ill and for good. And I suspect the same will be true of technology. And for that, thank you for listening and being patient.
Thank you very much, Professor Carrie Menkel-Meadow, for an extremely fascinating and thought-provoking speech. I'd like to invite the panelists up on stage. Can the panelists step onto the stage? And meanwhile, while the panelists are making their way up, we're going to ask you to use technology to supplement the panel discussion. So download the Twitter app and the hashtag SG Mediation Lecture for any questions that you may want to pose the panelists. Let me just introduce the panelists today. On your far right, that's the moderator, Mr. Francis Goh from Eversheds, Harry Elias LLP. Francis is in the firm's civil and commercial litigation practice group, and also private client and wealth management practice group. Francis is also the head of the arbitration practice group. To Francis's right, we have Assistant Professor Dorcas Quack-Anderson. She is from the Singapore Management University's School of Law. Before she joined the university as an academic, she had a distinguished career in the legal services, starting as a justice's law clerk and ending at the state courts as a district judge. To Dorcas's right, we have Mr. Yong Zikin. Yong Zikin describes himself as a technology, media, and telecommunications lawyer. He's one of the acknowledged experts in the area where technology and law meet. He is currently the Assistant Chief Executive, Personal Data Protection Commission of the Infocom Media Development Authority and Deputy Commissioner of the Professional Data Protection Commission. I'll hand over the floor to Francis. Francis?
Thank you, Sing-On. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we encourage you to use the Twitter feed to post your questions. We've already got one question that's come in. We're hoping for more to stream in, and then we'll put it up on screen. Meantime, I welcome the panel, Carrie, Zikin, and Dorcas. We've heard a lot of thought-provoking points, and the brave new world is upon us. Dorcas, perhaps you can tell us, where does Singapore mediation stand in this brave new world?
Oh, this is a very big open question. Yes, but I think I really like the lecture in terms of when you talk about mediation 2.0, and it has a certain connotation, at least from where you're from, it was mediation light. So I think it really throws open this question of, in the midst of innovation, how do we encounter innovation and allow innovation, but at the same time not stray away from the essence of mediation? Which I think you outlined very well from Mediation 1.0. Many jurisdictions, we do agree on what perhaps are the salient factors of mediation. Right, so on that front, I think what really strikes me is that having clarity about what we are doing, say even in our mediation programs, and really being careful not to to fall into a situation where mediation light, where there's a lack of regulation, lack of clarity as to what we are doing. So in that respect, I think we are quite fortunate that we have reached this stage where we are doing a lot of regulation. So mediation is not meant to be just something anyone can go into, right? So we have the Singapore International Mediation Institute, SIMI. Joe is here. Right. So I think that is a very good step, that there's professionalization. You're looking at mediation as a profession. There are certain standards, and with that, you have a conversation as to what really amounts to mediation. Are certain things allowed? Are certain things not allowed? Ethical principles. So that, I think, is a good development. I would stop at that.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Zikin. We've heard about the problems and dangers of technology. Where do we stand in Singapore on the technology front?
Actually, I thought that as we examine this question of mediation and online dispute resolution, I thought I'll share with the panel and the audience here the frame that I used to approach this question. ODR focuses on the dispute resolution. Mediation is one form of dispute resolution, but when we are talking about ODR platform, it's actually different types of mechanisms that you can use to resolve disputes. Over at the PDPC, we do a lot of facilitation, and we do a lot of it using technology. Today, it's still very old school. It's emails. We convey one request from the customer to the organization, bring it back, right? Very, very labor intensive. We are interested to see whether we can have an ODR platform that can make this process more efficient. But we are very clear, it is facilitation, not mediation. So coming to this topic, and I'll look at technology in the application of technology to mediation and online dispute resolution in the following steps. If you're talking about technology applied to facilitate mediation, we have a range. We have technology that can help us with the communication. In the typical ODR platform, we divide it into 3 phases. There is one, of course, the initial registration of the case, opening up a case, exchanging of simple details. Technology is fairly neutral there. We can go on to the next phase where we exchange a bit more information about the dispute that we have. Again, I think the technology can be neutral. It can help us in the communication of the information, but technology applied carefully can help to assist the communication in a more structured manner. We probably have, in the course of conducting mediation, come across lengthy documents, lengthy letters that meanders and touches all the points, right? Technology can help to facilitate a more structured response. The information gets exchanged in a more structured manner. It helps establish a clearer exposition of each party's position. If you want to throw in fancy technology there, you could also, through technology and maybe a bit of data analysis of past cases, provide some guidance or insights to the parties who are involved or engaged in the system. Maybe in a form that, hey, based on our analysis of cases with this profile, it's likely that this is how it was resolved in the past. What do you think, right? A bit of management of expectation, again, empowering, providing information. It's the next step that I think is, that's where we make a difference between algorithmic justice and mediation. To me, I'm old-fashioned. If you talk about mediation, at that step, you need a neutral. You need someone, because the whole basis of mediation is to help both parties come up with the solution. And how can we use technology to assist the co-creation of a solution? I think that we can, of course, communication technology will help. It can do distance mediation and all that. But I think that using technology to provide perhaps a bit of insight into the kind of likely resolution for this kind of archetype of cases can help, right? But it is important to understand that you're helping to create the solution as opposed to making a decision. Very different from the kind of examples we've heard when we talk about Mondria and those applications in eBay or e-commerce situations. Those, I think, are really just a means of dispute resolution. I'm no expert in giving a label to it, but it's a means of finding a way to resolve a low value, high volume case. Many times, it's really a big organization figuring out what's the best way that I can make use of technology to keep these clients happy, to manage the expectation of these clients, and we have to view the application of technology in that sense. Are we looking for true justice in the form of King Solomon in that kind of situation, or are we looking at using technology to reduce the frictions of daily life, to reduce the friction of online interaction by being able to apply rules, apply technology to come up with a quick enough, good enough resolution that most of the customers are going to be happy about.
Carrie, you were mentioning about the pure view of mediation, which was echoed by Zikin, which is basically two parties, one neutral, and then you alluded to the fourth party. Now, this fourth party, if the system is transparent, if it's fair, if it facilitates the discussion, would that actually be something that's good for mediation? Your views, please.
It can be. As I said, for me, the question is what kind of a dispute is it? I agree with Zikin here that those kinds of small amount, large volume cases, the fourth party can be very effective. It can actually reduce conflict because I think pure mediation is most appropriate when bringing people into a room together to speak directly to each other is the best way to solve the problem. As I said, I do not need to have a deep, soulful conversation with Amazon. But if I had a conflict with him, my husband, I would want to have a deep, soulful conversation with the third party. And I don't think I want the fourth party taping our interactions or having it uploaded in some way. So for me, the answer to these questions always is it depends. And I think the fourth party, all these platforms are extremely useful in some settings and not others. That's all. My concern is, if he's not here, but if Richard Susskind were here, I would say I think he over-exaggerates the possibility that technology as a single thing is somehow going to be equally useful in all areas of life. I agree our lives have all been changed enormously by technology. We don't go anywhere without our phones. If we can't connect to the internet, we get very upset. That has changed the way we behave. I watch my students, I hope it doesn't happen on the streets of Singapore, my students cross the street looking at their devices. And I know from some of the studies that have been done, passenger accidents are up. There was a study in New York City to show that there have been more bicycle and passenger accidents and fewer car accidents because there's rules. You can't text while you're driving. So I say this to say that technology it's omnipresent. It has changed our lives, but it can't change the way we do everything. So I would say fourth party technology for some things, but not for other things. I just want to say one other thing about pure mediation that I'm not sure I got to say. The challenge for me, and technology can assist in all the ways that Zikin said, I'm interested now in using the good part of mediation, scaling it up to bigger disputes that are not just two parties and fighting with each other. So the extent to which we're using mediation effectively and can online in international disputes, so we can call each other, we can Skype, we can share our documents, we can speak across different languages because people have time to go get a translation. That's a really effective use of using mediation facilitated communication devices and involving more people. So technology can amplify and help larger numbers of people resolve things together. I hope.
Well, thanks, Carrie. I'd like to encourage all of you to continue with your questions streaming in on Twitter. Yes, and I'm going to meanwhile direct a question to Dorcas now. Yes, technology is facilitative. If you had a wish list for Singapore mediation and the use of technology, what would that list look like?
Well, first of all, I'd like to agree with both Carrie and Seekin that it's a complex subject. And I think the difficulty is because technology is so varied, changing as we speak, and mediation is also varied. So I would just like to share, I think, personal views. I think that we have to be clear what technology we are referring to, which I think Seekin did allude to. What specific technology are we referring to? Is it artificial intelligence? Is it predictive analytics? Is it deep learning? And then being very careful and thoughtful as to what is the impact of using that on the dispute resolution behavior, or on elements of justice, or elements about mediation behavior. So I think we have to be very thoughtful about that, and then I think our conversation has brought that up. So for instance, if you are looking at technology assisting you, supporting you, which you have brought up, right, it can be very supportive. It can help you when we have a lot of cognitive biases as humans. Right? So it can actually support us by providing lots of tools that help us overcome those biases. Right? And at the same time, it can also, like Ziki mentioned, when you want people to talk, sometimes over a distance it can actually help. Right? You can help cool off when you have asynchronous communication, say by email or chat rooms, or you just log in wherever you want to talk to. It can help. So I think we have to be thoughtful and recognizing what the pitfalls are. Then we know how to design it in a way that will really meet the purposes we want. So if you mention things like Modria and a lot of the platforms that we use, I think it's interesting that the question has become not a dichotomous one as to whether we are replaced, whether mediators are replaced, but whether how best you can use technology and in an effective way. So I think most of the effective ones like Rightwiser, as it was highlighted earlier, human intervention is still very, very prominent. And so what we have is that something we have very well designed. You have first diagnosis of the problem, and then you have intervention by a person. So in that sense, moving forward, I think, in Singapore, we are all talking about we need to move, we are far behind. So I think we have to be careful and thoughtful as to what exactly we are trying to do. And in the system that we design, once you are informed by some of these pitfalls, we can design something that really meets the goals you want to achieve, including things like procedural justice, which it has been mentioned. I think at the ODL conference that there was a lot of talk about procedural justice, because much of what takes place in court, we have to look at, do people have a voice? And research has found that it really is effective if you have voice, opportunity to express yourself, you feel heard. And so we have to examine, do these things happen if we're using technology, especially mediation? So if you have someone who is a human mediator, if that mediator becomes replaced by technology, do you still feel heard in that sense? Or does the sense of being heard change? Yeah. So I think just being thoughtful about where we are going ahead and being careful in how we design.
Okay, thanks, Dorcas. Well, as you can see, the live stream has gone up on the main screen. And Carrie, this one's directed at you. Abdul Malik says, do you see mediation as replacing or reinforcing the restorative justice process? Comments, please.
That was my favorite question up there. Again, you'll see why I'm a mediator. The most important word in my vocabulary is and. There are very few questions that don't have two sides for me. So I would say, in some respects, technology is a problem for restorative justice, because for me, restorative justice is a deeply human process. I've been studying restorative justice in many post-conflict societies. If people can't meet face-to-face and really talk about what's important to them, it's very hard to imagine a feeling of being restored to our human wholeness without doing that in person. On the other hand, when you think about some of the mass injustices and atrocities in the world, sometimes you need little steps before you can take big ones. And for example, some of the work I've done in the Middle East, I've done some peace work in Israel and Palestine. Some of the most poignant things that I've seen are children that are now talking to each other on computers, where the wall separates Palestinians and Israelis. So again, I said I was dragged sort of kicking and screaming into the ODR world, but I can give you all some examples. And that's a very important place, because I think that's a place in which some of these mediative practices have to operate on the ground between the parties, where the governments are not being terribly successful at higher levels. So technology has actually been quite effective. Obviously, it can also, as we all know, technology has been used to plan terrorist attacks and to make things more violent in the world. That's the "and" part. Technology has made more violence, and it has also made more peace. I have seen children talking across those lines, and technology has made that possible.
Well, Zikin, this one's for you. LSO asked this question. Which neutral, in your view, is most vulnerable to disruption by technology? Judge, arbitrator, or mediator? Your views, please.
Actually, that question actually comes from the, I would say, I wouldn't use that lens to view this. We look into artificial intelligence and the application of AI technology to various sectors, including the legal sector. In this area, we are looking very seriously into the governance and the ethics issues, right? And I would propose this framework when we look about, when we talk about the application of AI and technology in the decision-making process. I use this analogy, or rather I use these three examples. Imagine the use of technology as a loop in providing inputs, going through a process, and coming out with output, right? There are three models. You can have man over the loop, man in the loop, or man out of the loop. A man over the loop essentially is a way of applying technology such that, hey, I would like to make decision A. I'm using technology to go through the data that helps provide me with the right way to make that decision. Okay, so for example, I want to achieve this end. What's the best way of achieving this end? What are the cases that I can refer to? What are the things that I can cite? You use technology to help you achieve that. Man over the loop. Man in the loop, right, is, okay, how should I decide? Still, the man is deciding, right? The person is deciding. How should I decide? I've got these inputs, right? There are, the system can suggest you can probably decide, make decision A, B, or C, right? And statistically, the decision it can be backed up because most people decide B, but you can do A and C. But it puts in your hands, in the adjudicator or in the decision maker's hands, the information for him to investigate. Because if he thinks that he wants to go with the majority, well, that's a decision that the person is making. If he thinks that actually, you know, I don't like decision B, I prefer A or C, then he can investigate and try to justify the decision that he's making. The dangerous model is actually man out of the loop, where the machine decides on its own, right? But ultimately, and this is something I keep repeating when we talk about artificial intelligence, the building of intelligent machines, we need to understand that AI is just a part in a machine. It's not, you know, Skynet, Judgment Day, you know. It's not that, you know. We are building it. We control which model we want to use. We control what the module is what decisions and actions the module is permitted to take. We can control. And I think that that's the kind of lens I would use when we talk about application of technology. So my answer to this is that actually if we use the proper governance framework, the proper ethical approach to this question, none of them would be made extinct or irrelevant, because technology should be applied to help us make better decisions, more data-driven decisions, as opposed to looking at technology with the fear that it will actually replace the decision maker.
Thanks, Zikin. Dorcas, this one's up your street. Nicole, thank you for the question. As a law student, what can we do to equip ourselves with the necessary skills to tackle mediation 3.0?
Oh, yeah, this is something close to my heart, and I'm sure also something close to Carrie's heart. So I firmly believe, too, that law students have to be equipped to solve problems. Well, mediation and negotiation, as in many law schools, is still an elective, right? But I personally believe that you can take a lot of steps to learn these kind of skills on your own. Well, of course, technology, you all probably know much more than we do. You're probably very well equipped how to use technology, but in terms of how to use it thoughtfully, I found it very interesting as I teach students that even though perhaps I'm not many years older, but I find there's a gap in the sense that they grew up with things since young which I have not been exposed to, whereas I actually went through that period where I think some of us went through where we did not have it, certain types of technology, and suddenly they came. So I could see that difference. But if someone you have grown up with it all your life, you can't imagine something without it. So I think a lot of it, you need to develop self-awareness as to how it's affecting you. I actually discussed it also with my husband. We talk about how it's affecting us if we keep looking at the phone, or whether we need to actually switch off the phone at a certain point in time to ensure that there's that face-to-face connection and we talk together rather than through a medium, and how it's affecting our minds on that. So problem-solving skills, how to use technology really very effectively, and have that face-to-face interaction, knowing when to use it and knowing when you use certain medium, how it affects your communication. I think there's a scholar, Noam Ebner, he has written about negotiation via email. He talks about a lot of research in terms of looking at the medium. So looking at whether it's a media-rich medium. For example, your email, for example, might not be media-rich in terms of catching contextual cues, whereas face-to-face is rich. How does that affect how you receive and how you transmit information? And how does it affect you when it's asynchronous or synchronous kind of communication? There's a time lag. How does it affect you? Is there misinterpretation? Is there more suspicion? You need to build trust. These are the things you can experiment, which I think you have done, for example, when they negotiate online, they learn that. And then you will be reflective and see how you can apply those lessons in your day-to-day negotiation. Yeah, and I think the year one students just went through a orientation tea, and someone gave them advice to be exposed beyond the law, because really that is what we have to do when you practice law, solving problems, so knowing how things work.
Thanks, Dorcas. Okay, we've got a question that throws up a bit of the ethical issues. Asha says, loss of privacy is one of the potential risks of ODR. What can be done to ODR platforms to ensure privacy of disputants? Carrie, perhaps you can take the ethical point, and then I'll bounce it to Zikin for the technological point.
This is a great question for what I wanted to say, what Dorcas was speaking to. It was very interesting to watch how negotiations evolved on email. So they first just began, and then lawyers that were using it realized that other people were reading their email, and it violated, we have very complex confidentiality and work privilege rules for lawyers in the United States. So now, lawyers, when you get an email from them, there's a long disclaimer at the bottom. This communication is confidential and protected and privileged, and no one should read it unless you are the addressee. And I'm a consumer of those because I also teach legal ethics. So I look at how these have gotten longer and longer and longer because they are reactions to things that have gotten people into trouble. So here's my question. I told you my students are doing an email negotiation, and one of them said, can we do texts? Text negotiation. Imagine that, right? Because my students, I don't know for all of you up here, my students aren't even using email anymore. That's too much of a pain in the neck to have to go log on somewhere. Everyone is just texting all the time on their phones, and there is absolutely no privacy on those texts. So I'm wondering what the disclaimers are going to be like. If someone's going to design, if there's any IT person out there, someone's going to have to design a little emoticon, you know, some little thing that says closed mouth or something that goes at the end of your message. Do not share this with anyone. Because at the moment, those texts, if people are negotiating by text, those are not protected. And I'm not making this up. I have friends who are lawyers in Los Angeles and New York that are doing they're negotiating contract deals by text. Some of these are my former ethics students, so it's very depressing.
Carrie.
Technically, it's less ethical if a lawyer and a client do that. What a client tells a lawyer is protected, privileged information that the lawyer can't reveal to anyone else without the client's input. If it's in a text, anyone can pick up the telephone and look at it. Anybody can see, if you don't have a password-protected telephone, anybody can look at it, anybody. And so that is a technical legal problem. I'm not convinced that those disclaimers at the bottom of emails actually solve the problem either. So I agree with you completely that texting and email have those same problems. It amplifies the communication. And our legal ethical rules are, the belief is that in order to get good legal advice, I want to be able to tell my lawyer everything and not have my lawyer go tell somebody else. And to get the best information, the lawyer has to promise me they're not going to tell anyone else. So that's what the problem is. And I agree that I don't think email's any better necessarily than text. I just see that the way young people are using text, they just do it all the time. They pass them to each other, and there's no protection at all. I think I'm going to create an emoticon. I'll share it with
yes,
you, right?
Thanks for jumping in. And Carrie, I think that closed-mouth emoticon might just start a trend among your students. We've got, due to time, we'll just take one last comment, and then that's over to Zikin. There's a last question that just squeezed in. It says here, what do you think will help reduce biasness of coders and financial backers of the ODR? I think it relates also to the privacy, so maybe you can take that as a bundled question.
Okay.
Thanks.
On the earlier question, just very quickly, I think that on the question of privacy, it's actually intertwined. Okay, there's the concept of privacy that we see as a common law right, expectation of privacy, right to seclusion and all that. But when we talk about privacy in communication, it's really that the right not to have your private communication publicized. The important thing about that is, as far as building ODR systems concerned, is you can have technology that can secure the transmission channel of the communication. You can also have technology that builds trust in the platform provider. And that can be a process that can be audited. That could be a process that can, where the platform provider can be open and say that this is what we do, this is how we preserve the confidentiality of the information, this is what we don't do with it, this is what we don't record, we don't allow people to snoop. So it comes down to trust and whether there are any processes that can be used to audit and check that trust. On the question of biasness, actually I had this very same discussion. The thing about data analytics and bias is actually, it just means that the data tends towards a certain result or a conclusion, and you just need to understand why that result or conclusion, it tends towards that result or conclusion, and understand the reasons for it. So it is important for us when we do this kind of bias identification to understand what were the parameters that went in, what were the input parameters that went in to identify. So for example, if, especially in financial credit ratings and credit decisions and all that, right? If it tends to be that a Chinese male of 45 who is a bit pre-obese will always never be granted a loan by the bank for buying a car, right? Why? Why is it, right? So what is the input parameter that caused that particular result? There is no real, there's no real magic to discerning this. And this is where in some conversations I had advocated a distinction between honesty and political correctness. In this area, there is a lot of thought going into this area. Should certain types of input parameters be prohibited? Processing by virtue of race or gender preference or religion or culture. Prohibit processing because of that, right? Well, if you do that, you may be losing out on valuable input parameters that will disclose why the particular bias resulted in the first place. I belong to the camp that, hey, be honest about the input parameters, identify so that you keep them so that you are better able to identify why or what were the input parameters that led to that bias in the data. But when you implement policies and make decisions, that's where we have to have very clear governance frameworks, very clear ethical rules to say that, hey, certain policies that that would discriminate against Chinese male of 45 from buying cars, right? That kind of policies shouldn't be implemented. So that I think would be my approach to this question of bias and how we can actually deal with that, as whether it is an application in the financial or any other kind of system.
So with that, I wish to thank everyone for your questions, and also please join me in extending thanks to our panelists, Carrie, Vikin, Dorcas, and with that, I hand it back to Seng-On.
I'd now like to invite Mr. Philip Fong, Managing Partner of Eversheds, Harry Elias, to present tokens of appreciation to those not from the organizers of the Singapore Mediation Lecture. That's Professor Carrie Menkel-Meadow and Yong Zi Kin. Finally, I'd like to invite the following persons up on stage for a group photograph. Justice Belinda Ang, Chairperson, Singapore Mediation Centre, and from SMU School of Law, Deputy Dean David Llewellyn, as well as Goh Yihan Dean, SMU School of Law. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's session, the end of today's lecture rather.